Hey guys, tonight we're traveling north, far north, to a land carved by glaciers, ringed by volcanoes, and ruled not by kings, but by cold, hard consensus. Welcome to medieval Iceland. It's the year 985, and you are not curled up in bed, but standing in a windswept field, sheep watching from a distance as the sky presses low overhead. In front of you rises a strange sort of courthouse, a turf-roofed longhouse, thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and fish oil. Inside, men in cloaks gather not to read books of law, because there are none but to remember it all. Every rule, every crime, every punishment lives only in their minds, and here you are summoned before them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and what time you're watching this. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of the world reaches. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots squelch in the muddy doorway as you step into the dim interior. It's warm but not cozy. The fire in the center hearth belches a bit too much smoke, and every eye in the room turns toward you. You're not the only one summoned tonight. This is Alþingi, the great General Assembly, and it's both Parliament and Court. The most powerful free men in the land gather here once a year at Thingvellir, a place where lava plains meet spring-fed streams to settle scores, recite laws, and occasionally brawl in the mud over whether someone technically insulted someone else's sheep. You shuffle to the side, heart thudding as the law speaker steps forward. This is no sleepy scribe. He's the living repository of the nation's entire legal code, appointed to memorize and speak the laws aloud each year from atop the law rock. That's not a cute nickname, it's a literal rock. And from it he booms the statutes over the valley like a Viking Moses. Tonight, though, he's indoors leaning heavily on a carved staff with cloudy eyes and a voice like cracked leather. He begins to chant. You were expecting maybe a few sentences. Instead, what flows out is a long, rhythmic recitation that sounds more like epic poetry than legal jargon. The laws are structured like verse with repeated patterns and mnemonic devices, because remember, no one is writing this down. Each rule must be recalled and spoken from memory. No pressure. As he drones on, you try to stay upright. Outside, sleet begins to rattle against the roof. Inside, someone sneezes into a fur cloak. You start to wonder what happens if the law speaker forgets something. Would that mean a particular crime just doesn't exist anymore? Historians still argue whether these oral laws allowed more flexibility or more chaos when things got messy. And things will get messy. You shift your weight, suddenly aware of the damp seeping through your socks. A man beside you, possibly a farmer, scratches his beard and mutters about goat thefts. Another leans in and hisses that last year someone was outlawed just for accusing a neighbor of hiding ghosts in his barn. It was a long trial, with poetry involved. Someone passes you a wooden cup, something strong, fermented, and vaguely suspicious. You sip, trying to blend in. You're not sure if you're a witness, a defendant, or just a very cold bystander. But it doesn't really matter. Once you're here, you're in the system. A few moments later, a new voice rises. A plaintiff, by the sound of it, and very aggrieved. He's holding up a soggy woolen cloak, claiming his neighbor cursed it, rendering his cows barren and his daughter too dreamy. Someone snorts. Someone else nods solemnly. This is not your average court drama. You glance up at the sagging rafters, noting how they creak under the weight of snow and the absurdity of the case being argued, yet every word spoken matters. Iceland's medieval courts, strange as they may seem, are rooted in social order. Every accusation, every counterclaim builds on the shared memory of justice, a memory held together by voices, tradition, and the occasional slap with a fish. And then silence. The law speaker lifts his hand. The judgment has been reached. It's not execution, exile, or torture. It's a public apology and the gifting of a goat. Apparently the accused offered a decent rhyme in his defense. Poetry saves lives here. As the crowd murmurs, you realize this isn't just law, it's theater. It's ritual. And it's the only thing standing between order and absolute feuding chaos on this icy island. Outside, the wind howls again, and somewhere across the valley, the glow of another turf longhouse pulses faintly in the dark, waiting for its own little courtroom scene to unfold. You stay put in the longhouse, and although your legs ache and your back is beginning to complain, no one else moves either. That's how you know this matters. It isn't just a gathering of loud men in wool tunics and stiff boots. It's the center of Iceland's justice system, the very spine of society. And oddly enough, it all hangs on a single man's memory, the law speaker. You watch as he lifts his chin and closes his eyes again. He's about to begin reciting once more. There are no scrolls, no carved tablets, no wax seals or records etched in metal. You've arrived in a land where the law is air and memory. Every rule you're expected to follow is floating in someone's brain, specifically this one elderly man in front of you whose job is to say the laws out loud from beginning to end every summer, whether people want to hear them or not. His voice is steady, trained by years of repetition. This isn't just recitation, it's performance. You hear the phrasing shift and flow like poetry. That's not a coincidence. The laws are deliberately structured with rhythm and alliteration. It's like Iceland's legal system was written by a bard with a fondness for consequences. The repetition helps with memorization, of course, but it also gives the whole affair a kind of hypnotic pull, as if the laws themselves are singing the rules of society into your bones. The crowd falls still again. This part is important. This is the part where the law speaker recites the entire framework of Icelandic governance from memory. How to summon witnesses, what fees are owed, for which wounds, which insults can trigger lawsuits, and which ones you're allowed to let slide, provided they're at least halfway poetic. You're trying to follow, but it's dense and fast and not exactly riveting. You blink, trying to keep up. One line sticks out. Something about the penalty for killing a man's horse being different, depending on whether the horse was tied up at the time. Another detail mentions how fines can be increased or decreased depending on the social standing of the person involved or how loudly they complain. Historians still argue whether these adjustments represented fairness or favoritism. Probably both. Possibly neither. The people gathered seem used to this. You glance around. One man is quietly chewing on a piece of dried fish. Another is absent-mindedly scratching a runic symbol into the wooden bench. But no one leaves. Because once a year, the laws must be spoken in full. That's the rule, and breaking the rule means inviting chaos. What's wild is that the law speaker isn't the judge. He doesn't make decisions. He just recites the code. Think of him as the legal software. The people around him are the ones interpreting what he outputs. If they all agree a law has been broken, they debate what should be done. But the initial source, the law download, must come from memory spoken out loud in front of everyone. Suddenly he pauses. There's a moment of silence. Then he starts again exactly where he left off. You realize with a start that there are no backups. If he forgets a part, the law might disappear for a year. If he misstates a word, the meaning can shift. And if he dies suddenly, without passing his knowledge on, well, good luck sorting out your property disputes. No pressure, right? You wonder what kind of training this man went through. He likely started young, apprentice to a previous law speaker. Memorizing the entirety of Icelandic law would have taken years. It's not just facts and rules. It's names, phrasing, exceptions, and community-specific precedents. And all of it must be kept up to date without being written down. You're starting to understand why people treat the law speaker like a sacred artifact with a beard. And yet, for all this formality, there's also a certain looseness to the proceedings. A kind of rural practicality. One woman barefoot with her hair in braids shuffles forward to lodge a complaint about her neighbor's sheep. Apparently the woolly beast keeps wandering into her garden and munching her cabbage. The defense: the sheep is emotionally sensitive and only calms down near certain vegetables. The crowd murmurs. Some laugh. But here's the thing, this isn't a joke. Not really. The case will be weighed like any other. If the damage is deemed serious enough, the sheep's owner might owe cabbage compensation or be required to build a better fence. Or maybe someone will have to write a poem apologizing on the sheep's behalf. Icelandic justice at this stage isn't about incarceration, it's about restitution and reputation. Because you can't imprison someone when there are no prisons, you feel a chill. It creeps in through the doorway and slithers along the floor like a draft with opinions. You wrap your cloak tighter. And still the law speaker continues. He moves on now to rules about inheritance, about grave robbing, about what to do if your house burns down and the neighbor swears they were just baking bread next door. One section details how to resolve a dispute. If both parties claim to have caught the same fish at the same time, the answer involves witnesses measuring tape and a whole lot of yelling. You're starting to get the picture. This isn't law as command. It's law as memory, as a shared community song. Still, not everyone agrees on the lyrics. Even in the modern era, scholars can't decide how accurate the oral tradition was. Did people selectively forget inconvenient laws? Did powerful families nudge the law speaker to adjust a phrase or two? Could new laws be added quietly between verses? Probably. Definitely. But that was the point. It was alive. Iceland's legal code, unlike the cold stone codes of other medieval societies, was breathing an organic network of rules shaped by climate, community, and the occasional cabbage-eating sheep. The fire in the longhouse sputters. The man beside you sneezes loudly and mutters an apology to no one in particular. You check the ceiling beams. Still intact. And the law speaker drones on. He has hours left to go. Now that you've heard hours of memorized law, sung into existence by a single gray-bearded man, you'd think things would start to settle down. But no. If anything, the mood in the longhouse has shifted, tightened, because now comes the part that everyone dreads and secretly lives for the personal feuds. It begins quietly enough. Two men step forward, both wearing sheepskin cloaks, crusted with old snow. They won't meet each other's eyes. One is younger with wind-burned cheeks and a voice like gravel. The other is older eyes, sunken fingers, yellowed by pipe ash. They stand in front of the group as the murmurs hush. The younger one speaks first. His claim. The older man's nephew, who isn't present, naturally stole a goat 6 weeks ago and slaughtered it in the woods. He describes the goat in heartbreaking detail, the curved horn, the white patch on its flank, the strange way it walked like it had secrets. The listeners nod. Goats here aren't just livestock. They're property, currency, even kin. In a land where survival hinges on every scrap of food and fur, a goat is worth more than a casual shrug. But this isn't just about a goat. It never is. The older man denies it, of course. His voice is quiet but iron hard. His nephew, he says, was miles away at the time, fishing. Witnesses know. But then again, the accuser has no proof, either just hoof prints in the snow and a gnawed bone found near a fire pit. You can feel it, how this isn't going to end with words. In medieval Iceland, there are no police to handle this. No forensic investigators. When things like this go unresolved, families take matters into their own hands. You've entered the realm of the blood feud. Here's the deal: if someone wrongs you and the community doesn't punish them sufficiently, you have two choices. Swallow your pride or get revenge. In this world, that second option is not only expected but often respected. If you don't retaliate, your honor is questioned. Your status in the village erodes like volcanic rock in a hard rain. Soon people stop trusting you to defend your sheep, your land, or even your name. You've heard stories already whispered over dried fish and stale beer. A minor insult at a wedding feast spiraled into 3 deaths and a burned longhouse. A game of dice gone sour left one man stabbed with a whale rib and another blinded in one eye with salt. Justice is a balancing act. If the law doesn't restore it, someone's going to do it with an axe. Historians still debate just how many Icelandic blood feuds erupted in any given generation. Some claim they were rare dramatic exceptions. Others argue they were regular seasonal events like haymaking, but with more funerals. What's certain is that the sagas are filled with them, and they weren't shy about the gory details. These weren't just personal vendettas, they were family affairs stretching across generations like sour inheritances. In the longhouse, tension rises. The law speaker listens carefully. As both men finish speaking, he doesn't pass judgment. That's not his role. Instead, he lets the murmurs spread. A group of elders steps in to discuss the matter. You notice how carefully they speak, how they avoid direct accusations. One wrong word and this becomes a feud. One misplaced opinion and the blood cycle begins. Eventually someone proposes a payment. Silver for the goat, maybe a barrel of dried herring too. It seems reasonable. The younger man hesitates, clearly unsatisfied, but nods. He spits in his palm and slaps it into the hand of the goat's uncle. For now, the feud is avoided, but not forgotten. Later that evening, as the meeting disperses and you step out into the frosty air, you catch sight of the younger man crouched by a fire, whispering something to a companion. His voice is low, but you catch one word clearly next time. That's how it always begins. You walk slowly through the snow-packed path back to your lodging. A long house tucked behind a grove of twisted birch trees, the kind that creak even when there's no wind. You imagine how many disputes still simmer in the darkness. Family land, marriage promises, broken sleds. There's no official count, but every person you pass tonight might be carrying a grudge, just waiting for its moment to spark. This is the challenge of a law system without enforcement. There are no enforcers, no jails, and few punishments that go beyond fines or social shame. That means a lot of justice is handled, informally, quietly, permanently. You sit near the hearth that night trying to warm your fingers. A local woman, elderly and sharp-eyed, tells you about her brother long dead. They never proved it, she says, stirring the stew, but everyone knew who did it. He didn't trip and fall into the ravine. That man was pushed. You nod, pretending not to shiver. Feuds don't always need courtrooms. They just need memories. And this country, icy, silent, and vast, is full of long memories. The air has turned even sharper today, the kind that sinks into your bones before your cloak has time to adjust. You trudge back to the meeting ground at Thingvellir with stiff limbs and a tight grip on the cup of sour milk someone handed you for breakfast. The sky remains indifferent, a pale sheet stretched overhead, but the mood feels different, heavier, because today the gathering will deal with something that's less about goats and cabbage and more about who gets to live inside society and who gets pushed beyond its borders. You find your place again near the edge of the crowd just as the murmur of voices settles into a hush. At the center of it all stands a man. He's broad-shouldered with weathered hands and a frayed sealskin belt. His eyes flick around the group with a kind of animal alertness, as if already anticipating something worse than judgment. The charges against him: murder not in battle, not in self-defense, but in a drunken rage over fishing rights. Two men step forward to speak. One is the brother of the dead man, and his voice trembles not with grief, but with tightly coiled rage. The other is a neighbor who claims to have seen the body face down in a shallow creek, with a jagged wound across the temple. As they speak, the accused remains silent, not proud, not even defiant, just exhausted. You can't tell whether he knows what's coming or whether he's already beyond caring. This isn't just a fine, not something that can be resolved with a goat or a poem. Iceland has no jails, no dungeons, no gallows, but it has ut-legged outlawry, and that in this world is worse than death. When a person is outlawed, they are not arrested or shackled. They are declared outside the law. From that moment forward, they are no longer protected by it. Anyone may harm them, rob them, or even kill them with no legal consequences. Their name is erased from legal record. Their rights vanish like steam in winter air. You watch as the elders deliberate. There are no robes, no gavels, just thick-bearded men with sharp eyes and long memories. The law speaker remains still, but you sense that the room already knows the outcome. The evidence may be thin, but the feeling is solid. Icelandic law runs as much on collective perception as it does on proof. After a short pause, a verdict is pronounced full outlawry. And just like that, the man is no longer part of Iceland. No one touches him. No one yells. But a quiet boundary has formed around him, invisible and total. He stands motionless, then slowly turns, stepping away from the crowd. No one offers help. No one says goodbye. He is alive, but already a ghost. Outlawry isn't exile in the way you'd imagine. He's not being sent to another country. He's simply being told to leave and never return. The wilderness beyond the settled farms is vast and brutal black lava fields, wind-torn cliffs and freezing rivers. Maybe he'll find shelter. Maybe he'll die trying. Either way, he cannot return. Not legally, not spiritually, not without risking death on sight. And there's no end date. Sometimes outlawry lasts 3 years, sometimes forever. The court can decide. And unless someone takes up your case again at another assembly and successfully negotiates a settlement, your sentence remains. You are simply gone, but inconveniently alive. Historians still argue how common full outlawry was. Some believe it was rare and used only in extreme cases. Others think it was used more liberally, sometimes as a tool of social control or even revenge. After all, accusing someone of a serious crime could remove a rival, clear a path to inheritance, or simply satisfy a grudge. With no centralized authority to investigate, everything came down to testimony, charisma, and alliances. And this is what terrifies you most. Justice here isn't a system, it's a consensus. You think back to earlier cases. A goat dispute ends with shared custody. A fish insult leads to a poetic apology. But now one misstep or one person with enough sway, and you can be erased like a chalk drawing in the rain. Later, as you walk the edge of the plain, you see the outlaw again. He's far off, trudging over a ridge, his figure shrinking beneath a sky that no longer includes him. You wonder what his plan is. Will he build a shelter in some forgotten fjord, try to trade secretly with isolated farmers? Or maybe he'll return years later under cover of darkness to try and slip into a feast and pretend he never left. But that's a dangerous game. If anyone recognizes him, they have the right, no, the duty to kill him. And so he keeps walking. Back at the campfire, stories spread. Someone says the outlaw once saved a drowning boy in spring. Someone else claims he hexed a man's boat to drift backwards during high tide. A woman mutters that she always knew he was cursed. The tales shift and morph like smoke. Now that he's beyond the law, he's no longer a man. He's a myth in the making. That's how Icelandic memory works. It turns people into symbols, sometimes saints, more often monsters. By nightfall, the space he once occupied feels colder, not physically, just emotionally emptier, as if everyone knows they could be next. There's no jail to fear, no uniformed authority, only the ever-watching community where silence is a sentence and forgetting is a form of burial. You return to your bedroll near the edge of the assembly site, the wind rising across the plain. Somewhere out there a man now walks, without a name, without protection, without warmth. And tomorrow more names will be called. The sun never truly rises here, not in the way you're used to. It just sort of slides up halfway, then hovers there, squinting across the rocks, like someone who forgot their glasses. You wake stiff, brush-dried moss from your cloak and stretch your limbs beneath a sky that never fully commits to daylight. It's court season in Iceland after all, and the gods of weather have their own laws to enforce. This morning, though, there are no outlaws on trial, no accusations of murder, theft, or attempted sorcery. Today the court deals with something much simpler and yet no less significant. Who owes what to whom and how much silver a black eye is really worth. That's right. You've stumbled into the wonderfully bizarre world of wound fees. The concept is straightforward on the surface. Hurt someone and you owe them money. But medieval Iceland took that logic and gave it a twist. Here the compensation is predetermined, detailed, and weirdly specific, like an ancient version of a personal injury claim chart, but carved into communal memory. rather than courtroom walls. A man with a bruised cheek stands before the gathering. He looks slightly sheepish and a little bit proud, like someone who got punched at the wrong feast but didn't spill his drink. He names the accused a neighbor large and ruddy who supposedly threw the first blow over a dispute about fish storage and someone's overly dramatic wife. The crowd chuckles. The accused doesn't deny it. But now the debate isn't about guilt. It's about value. You watch as the law speaker and several gray-bearded elders begin to recite injury classifications from memory. It's like listening to a medieval version of a legal menu. A knocked-out tooth carries a standard fine. A broken nose requires double that. A severed earlobe. That depends, was it the whole lobe or just a chunk? The victim pulls back his hood to reveal a small but dramatic shiner. The eye is swollen, the skin around it gone purple-black, like an old plum. The crowd leans in, some whistle low. A woman near you mutters, "That's at least 3 ounces." And she might be right. Icelandic law didn't just deal with the fact of injury, it put price tags on them. It treated violence like damage to property and the human body like something that could be itemized. Cut someone's forehead. That's a half mark of silver. Knock out their molar. Now we're talking full compensation. One man suggests a 4-ounce fine. Another says 5. A third argues that the punch happened in public, which raises the shame factor and the payment. The group starts negotiating. Historians still debate the origin of these wound fees. Some trace them back to older Germanic tribal customs where every body part had a price from pinky fingers to collarbones. Others suggest they were a local solution to the lack of centralized punishment. If you can't lock someone up, at least make them pay up. Either way the system worked, it was precise and oddly civil. If you cut a man's hand, you didn't fear execution. You feared a ruined purse. Of course, the fees weren't just symbolic. Silver in Iceland wasn't exactly lying around in buckets. Most people bartered for goods. Which means when you owed someone for a broken finger, you might end up paying in buttercloth, dried fish, or even sheep. One saga tells of a man who owed such a large wound fee that he had to marry off his daughter and donate a full sled of hay just to cover someone's cracked rib. You shift where you're sitting as the crowd reaches consensus. The fine for today's black eye will be 5 ounces of silver, or in practical terms, a well-fatted sheep and a leather satchel. The men shake hands. A few people clap. Justice, as usual, ends in commerce. But then someone else steps forward. This time it's not about physical injury, it's about words. A tall, narrow-faced farmer accuses his cousin of calling him a coward in front of women. The insult, he says, was shouted across a field during a horse race. The exact phrase, "You ride like a man who drinks his milk warm," gasps, chuckles, someone drops a stick. As strange as it sounds, this is serious. In a culture where reputation is everything, insults could be treated as legal offenses, especially if they implied cowardice, infidelity, or unmanliness. These were called nid, and they could carry heavy consequences, fines, apologies, or in some cases even fights. The accused shrugs, clearly unbothered. "He does drink warm milk," he mutters. The crowd erupts, but the law speaker raises a hand, and once again the air goes still. A judgment is made. The insult stands. But because it involved no specific threat or slander against family, only a partial fee is owed. 2 ounces to be paid in wool. The cousin rolls his eyes but accepts. As the assembly breaks for stew and midday rest, You realize something: these people have no interest in perfect justice. What they care about is balance. If you hurt someone, you pay. If you insult them, you pay a bit less. And if you lie about it, you pay double. Not because they're obsessed with fairness, but because they're obsessed with avoiding endless revenge. That's the magic of Icelandic law. It isn't designed to control behavior, it's designed to redirect it. Away from bloodshed, towards sheep. The next case begins. You stay seated, strangely captivated, because you never thought you'd care this much about a swollen eye or a milk-based insult. But in this cold land of lava fields and law songs, even a bruised ego can buy a goat. The wind picks up as the next case begins fluttering cloaks and whistling through the crags around Thingvellir, like a restless spirit trying to get in on the discussion. You wrap your cloak tighter and settle back into your spot among the crowd. Your knees creak. Your toes have lost sensation. And the smell of fermented shark is starting to cling to your nostrils, but you wouldn't leave now. Because what's unfolding today is stranger than any saga, a case that involves neither blood nor goats, but the ancient Icelandic version of a lie detector test. Trial by hot iron. You shift uneasily. That doesn't sound metaphorical. The crowd parts and two women step forward, both of them strong-shouldered and thickly wrapped in furs. One is accusing the other of theft, specifically a necklace made of glass beads, and one bright blue stone gifted by a sailor and said to bring luck in childbirth. The accused denies it. No one saw the crime. There's no evidence. But the missing necklace remains, and so does the suspicion. Normally, this sort of conflict would be resolved through testimony and compensation. But sometimes when words fail and tempers rise, the court turns to older tools. Ritual ones. One of the elders steps forward holding what looks like a long metal rod, already blackened at the edges from fire. You feel your chest tighten. This isn't symbolic. This is exactly what it looks like. Trial by ordeal. Here's how it works. The accused must carry a piece of red-hot iron across a certain distance, usually 9 paces, without dropping it. Afterward, her hand will be bound and left to heal for 3 days. On the 4th, the bandages will be removed. If the wound is clean and healing, innocent. If it festers, guilty. It's not a perfect system, but it's the system they have. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were intended as real judgments or theatrical warnings. Some claim the iron was sometimes cooled secretly, a kind of wink and nod deal between local leaders to avoid actual harm. Others insist that the ordeal was deadly serious, a way to let God decide when humans couldn't. What's clear is that people believed in it, and belief here is law. You watch as the accused steps forward. She doesn't argue. She doesn't cry. She simply nods once and rolls up her sleeve. A fire is stoked. The iron bar is heated until it glows like an ember. Then, with a breath so deep it seems to come from her ancestors, she reaches down and lifts the bar. No scream. She walks the 9 paces, eyes locked straight ahead. Her boots crunch slowly over packed earth, and the steam from her breath mixes with the smoke from her hand. When she reaches the end, she gently lowers the bar onto a flat stone and kneels, her face still impassive. A healer steps in to bind the hand. The judgment will wait for 3 days. The necklace remains missing. The tension, however, is very much present. As the crowd disperses for the moment, you wonder what kind of courage or resignation it takes to subject yourself to pain like that. Whether guilty or not, the ordeal is a gamble with skin in the game. Literally. No fancy words, no silver coins, just you fire and fate. But Icelandic justice isn't always so fiery. Sometimes it prefers cold logic. Later that afternoon, another case is brought forth, this time over land boundaries. Two brothers are arguing over a stretch of pasture that lies between their farms. One claims the river shifted and took his fence with it. The other insists the original boundary stone still counts, even if it's now underwater. There are no hot irons involved this time, just long sticks, old maps, and a lot of shouting. But the energy is no less intense, because land here means survival. Every patch of moss, every stretch of hayfield, every cluster of rock has value, and claiming more than your share, that's not ambition. That's theft with consequences. Eventually a compromise is reached. A new boundary will be drawn halfway between the two claimed markers. One brother agrees to build a shared fence, the other agrees to stop accusing him of witchcraft during winter festivals. You smile progress. Still, not every dispute ends so neatly. You hear whispers later about a different ordeal, one involving cold water and a woman accused of shape-shifting into a fox. They say she was tied and thrown into a pond. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, innocent. No word on whether she floated. Again, historians debate, were these tests symbolic, were they trials or threats? In some cases, it seems people voluntarily chose ordeal, believing it could prove their innocence when words failed them. In others, it was imposed by force or fear. But either way, the idea held, if you could pass the trial, you earned your freedom. You glance around the field and realize just how few actual enforcers there are. No guards, no gallows. The people here don't fear handcuffs, they fear judgment. They fear exile. They fear the look in a neighbor's eye that says, I no longer trust you. That's the heart of it. Icelandic justice wasn't about punishing with violence. It was about proving something: truth, guilt, innocence, through whatever means people believed in. Whether that meant carrying iron, standing in water, or telling the best story in the loudest voice. And here on this frozen island, where belief can be more powerful than evidence that was often enough, you lie awake that night listening to the wind through the cracks in the longhouse wall. Somewhere a woman waits with a burned hand, hoping the wound stays clean. Somewhere else, a boundary stone sits silently underwater, holding back a feud. And justice, strange and slow, continues its careful march across the snow. By the time morning breaks, if you can call this watery spill of light morning, you've started measuring time not in hours but in cases. You've now lived through a goat dispute, an exile, a black eye's worth of silver, and a woman who walked 9 paces with a bar of fire in her hands. So it's a little jarring when today's first case is about teeth. Yes, teeth. You blink through the cold. Adjust your wool hood and listen as a wiry, beardless man steps forward to accuse another of knocking out his molar during a late-night brawl at a feast. The accused is broad-shouldered and silent, the sort of man who folds his arms and lets his eyebrows do the talking. But the law here is weirdly ready for this. The law speaker begins reciting from memory, without even pausing to squint at the victim's mouth, a list of fines tied to dental damage. It's impressively specific. If a front tooth has lost 3 ounces of silver, a side molar slightly less. If the victim swallowed the tooth, it must be mentioned. If the tooth was already loose, the fine could be challenged. And if the tooth broke during the bite of a roasted sheep's leg, well, sorry, that's not legally someone else's problem. This is all real. Medieval Icelandic law didn't just protect bodies, it categorized them. You get the sense that someone somewhere had a very long winter with not enough firewood and way too much time to codify the difference between tooth knocked out and tooth cracked, but still hanging on. And the best part? They memorized all of it. The law speaker, in a slow, rhythmic voice, confirms 1 molar punched out cleanly in front of 10 witnesses. Result 4 ounces of silver. Case closed. But just as the accused is about to make payment through the traditional method of counting out little silver discs on a plank of polished whalebone, someone else stands up and says, "Wait." There was another blow, and it struck his nose. A ripple goes through the crowd. Ah, yes, the nose. The ancient lightning rod for insult, injury, and unnecessary escalation. This opens a whole new category of discussion, the price of a damaged nose. Apparently, the law distinguishes between a bruised nose, a bloodied one, and one that has been broken into a new shape. The victim is asked to tilt his head back so that the elders may examine it. One woman squints. "It leans now," she says. "It didn't lean before." Everyone nods. There's something charming and ridiculous about how much attention is being given to a crooked nose. But here it's deadly serious. Because these fines are not just about compensation, they're about preventing revenge. In a society with no prisons, no army, and no king, the only thing that keeps a community from unraveling is the ability to say, "I've been paid. I won't burn your house down." Historians still argue whether this approach to bodily harm, itemizing and compensating, rather than punishing, made Iceland more peaceful or more passive-aggressive. Some claim it encouraged restraint. Others argue it merely pushed violence behind closed doors, where it festered in the dark. Either way, it worked. Mostly. You shuffle to the side as another case begins, this time involving a head injury. Someone apparently fell off a horse and accused his companion of pushing him, rather than the horse merely bucking in fear. Again, the compensation is pre-calculated. A gash on the scalp that bleeds for more than a day. 2 ounces. If it leaves a scar visible from across a room, add 1 more. But here's where things get unexpectedly modern. The injured man pulls back his hood to reveal a scar that he claims came from this incident. But his opponent insists the scar is older, from a sled accident in his youth. Now the crowd has to decide, is this an old wound rebranded for profit or a fresh offense? An elder squints. "I remember that scar. He had it before. He showed it to me during midsummer." The room murmurs approval. Case dismissed. You stifle a laugh. Icelandic law may be strange, but it's also incredibly local. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone remembers everything. No one is truly anonymous. In a way, that's the real justice system here, not the spoken codes or the wound charts, but the fact that your life is never invisible. By midday, someone brings you a hunk of dark rye bread and a strip of dried lamb fat. You chew as a new case begins. A boy no older than 14 stands accused of throwing a stone that split open another boy's forehead. It was during a game. No one died. But the wound is impressive and visible. The boy's father offers to pay the fine himself using 2 ewes and a sack of barley. It's accepted. No lecture, no punishment, just an agreement. The boy will heal, the family will pay. Everyone goes home with their nose in place. You think about this as the sun hovers over the western ridge like a flickering candle. In some ways, Iceland's laws feel more practical than what you're used to. There's no incarceration, no chains, no chance to be locked away and forgotten. There's only this harm acknowledgement compensation. Heal. Move on. And maybe in the long run, that simplicity is what kept people sane through the wind and the snow and the endless dark. Not forgiveness necessarily, but balance. A way to walk away from pain and carry it only in scars, never in silence. By now you've become oddly fluent in Icelandic injury pricing. You know how much a molar costs, what bruising to the eye, commands in silver, and even the legal consequences of a cracked rib suffered during a drunken wrestling match. But this morning things take a slightly more surprising turn, because today the person stepping forward to sue is a woman. You blink twice to be sure. Not because you're surprised she's present, but because she's standing with full authority. Head uncovered, voice firm, not accompanied by any man. She's here to make a claim on her own behalf. And no one seems remotely bothered. In medieval Iceland, this wasn't as rare as you'd expect. Unlike many of their European neighbors, Icelanders granted women, at least free women of certain households, the right to own property, file legal claims, and act as witnesses in court. You lean forward, slightly curious. This is going to be different. Her case is as precise as any man's. She accuses a neighboring household of destroying a fence that protected her sheep. Not only that she claims they did so after a verbal agreement had been made to avoid grazing disputes. The fence was intentionally broken, she says, during the night before a winter storm, which left her sheep vulnerable, and several died. The opposing party, a wiry man with a high forehead and nervous fingers, denies everything. He says the storm did the damage, that maybe the sheep wandered off, that he had nothing to do with it. But she's come prepared. She has 2 witnesses, both shepherds, who saw the fence trampled and later heard someone muttering near the rocks at dawn. The court listens. The law speaker waits, impassive. Then slowly he begins to recite the relevant law. Fencing obligations were detailed in Icelandic law with a level of care that seems almost comic. You'd think this was a kingdom ruled by livestock, but that's not far from the truth. In a landscape where food could vanish with a single storm, sheep were survival. Fences weren't just property markers, they were lines between life and starvation. The elders confer. The woman stands still, silent, except for the slight tremble in her mittened hands. Finally, a judgment. The accused must pay compensation for the lost animals, repair the damaged fence, and issue a formal apology in front of the gathered community. He does so grumbling with all the enthusiasm of a man chewing bark. But he does it, and everyone nods. She's not finished. She then files a second claim slander. The same man, she says, referred to her in public as half a housekeeper and half a witch. The insult might sound quaint to modern ears, but here it's a legal landmine. Public insults against women, especially those implying sexual promiscuity, mental instability, or unnatural power, were considered dangerous, and they were punishable by law. Historians still debate whether this made Icelandic society more progressive or just more structured in its patriarchy. On one hand, women could sue and be heard. On the other, they were also scrutinized more severely, with reputation treated like porcelain, valuable but fragile. You look around and notice something else. The crowd isn't laughing, they're listening. The insult isn't brushed off. It's examined with the same care they gave to broken noses and stolen sheep. After brief deliberation, the court rules again another fine, this time paid in dried fish and a public poem of apology. You almost feel sorry for the man as he stumbles through the rhymes. Something about honesty, moonlight, and respecting strong women. It's awkward, but it's done. And just like that, the woman's reputation is restored by law, by rhyme, and by ritual. You wonder what her life is like outside this field of legal proceedings. Does she run a farm alone? Does she have sons or daughters or neighbors who resent her assertiveness? You'll never know. But in this moment, she stands fully within the law, not beneath it, not around it, inside it. Later that day, another woman approaches, not to accuse, but to testify. Her brother is on trial for failing to deliver a promised dowry. She doesn't take sides. She simply explains the agreement when it was made and who heard it. Her presence isn't questioned. No one stops her. She speaks and the law listens. Again, this isn't universal. Enslaved women had no rights. Foreign women were often ignored. But among free-born women of certain families, legal agency existed, and it mattered. Not equality, perhaps, but voice. You sit through the afternoon with a kind of warm respect growing in your chest. You hadn't expected this. For a place that punishes insults with fish, and exile Iceland turns out to be strangely modern in some corners. The law here isn't fast. It isn't clean, but it has space for voices you didn't expect to hear. As the sun dips behind the jagged hills, a gentle snow begins to fall, not heavy just enough to blur the lines between sky and land. People begin to pack up for the evening. Cloaks are tightened. Fires are stoked. The woman who stood at the center of it all today walks past you without a glance. She doesn't need approval. She already has what she came for: justice and the right to claim it in her own name. The fire crackles low beside you as dawn seeps across the volcanic horizon in pale streaks of blue and pink. You're starting to notice how quiet the mornings are here. Not in a peaceful way exactly, but in a held breath kind of way. Like the earth itself is waiting to hear what today's court will bring. You make your way back to the assembly field, boots crunching over the packed frost, your cloak damp from yesterday's snow, and just in time because today's case doesn't involve fists or fences or flung insults. It involves ghosts. Well, sort of. You squeeze between two men standing at the edge of the crowd. In the center, an older fisherman in a red wool tunic is already speaking, and his voice carries like wind off the sea. He says that 2 nights ago his boat capsized in calm weather near a fjord. The stars were clear, the tide was normal, but something pulled the boat, jerked it sideways like a hand yanking a string. His nets twisted. His son nearly drowned. And he says it wasn't natural. He believes the fjord is haunted. A few people laugh softly. Others look worried, because this isn't the first time someone said it. A different man, one with a missing thumb and eyes like river stones, nods gravely and says he's heard voices near that same stretch of water. A low hum, almost like chanting. A third says her husband won't fish there anymore even though the cod are plentiful. You'd think this sort of thing wouldn't make it into a legal proceeding. But you'd be wrong. Because in medieval Iceland, the boundary between the legal and the supernatural was porous. If someone claimed a place was cursed or that their livestock failed because of a spirit, the law might not always punish anyone, but it would listen. The fisherman isn't accusing a ghost. He's accusing a neighbor, a man who lives near the haunted fjord and has, according to rumor, studied strange texts and once buried a cat upside down beneath a new barn. That man steps forward now, calm and unbothered. He smiles politely and says he has no idea what anyone's talking about. Yes, he lives near the fjord. No, he hasn't summoned anything. And if he had, surely he wouldn't be clumsy enough to let it yank boats around like a child playing with driftwood. It's a convincing response. But the fear in the air is thicker than his charm. You realize something important as you watch the elders deliberate in this society. Belief carries legal weight. Maybe no one will be fined or punished today. But if the court acknowledges that the fjord might be dangerous, they can issue a kind of social warning, one that spreads quickly. It's not just law, it's protective storytelling, a way of shaping public behavior without declaring anyone guilty. And that matters, because in Iceland, if enough people believe you've summoned a ghost, your life can get very small, very fast. People stop trading with you, they avoid your animals, they whisper behind your back, and eventually someone brings your name up in court, again this time with more serious consequences. Historians still debate whether these ghost-related cases were metaphorical or literal. Some suggest they masked real fears, failed crops accidents at sea, even disease. Others argue they were simply another form of community control. After all, if the law takes your story seriously, even when it involves the dead, you're less likely to take revenge with a knife or poison. Eventually, the court decides not to punish anyone, but they do something subtler. They recommend a cleansing ritual. A local chieftain will recite protective verses by the fjord, and a sheep will be sacrificed, not for evidence, for balance. You blink. So the legal remedy here is poetry and mutton. You've seen Stranger. As the fisherman nods, looking satisfied, the accused bows graciously. Whether he believes in spirits or not, he now understands that his reputation is on the line. He'll keep a low profile for a while, maybe light a few extra candles during storm season. But you're not finished with strangeness yet. Later that day, a case is brought, involving a woman who claims she dreamed of her dead husband warning her not to remarry because her suitor has empty eyes and a fox's shadow. She presents this dream as a reason to delay the arranged match, and her family supports her. Now, this is where things get truly medieval. Dreams in Iceland weren't just nighttime stories. They were considered valid messages, sometimes from the gods, sometimes from the dead, and sometimes from the darker corners of the spirit world. If someone had a dream vivid enough and believed it strongly enough, they could bring it into court as a sort of moral evidence. The suitor, to his credit, doesn't argue. He looks shaken, actually. Maybe the dream rang true. Maybe he does have something foxy in his soul. Either way, he agrees to step back for now. The woman bows. Case closed. You sit back amazed. In a world where proof is often scarce and logic can only go so far, stories fill the gap. Stories about haunted water, about dreams that echo through stone, about cats buried upside down and fish that vanish in moonlight. This isn't law as you know it. This is law as mythology. And somehow it works. You leave the gathering that evening with a strange, tingling clarity. Justice in Iceland isn't just about facts. It's about memory, belief, rhythm, and fear. And occasionally about a fjord that might be listening to everything you say. The night passes in a slow hush, broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the low creak of your longhouse beams settling into frost. You dream of fjords whispering to one another, of cats blinking from beneath earth of spirits in tunics, quoting legal statutes in verse. When morning comes, the dream clings to your skin like cold mist, and you rise still feeling halfway between the human world and something older, wilder, and deeply Icelandic. Today you return to Thingvellir, expecting more ghostly tales or inherited grudges. Instead, the court opens with something surprisingly sharp, a poem, and not a flattering one. A thin man stands in the middle of the crowd, arms crossed, reciting in a crisp, sing-song cadence. His target, another man, tall, red-faced, clearly furious, accused of cheating in trade and cowardice in battle. But it's not what was said that matters most. It's how it was said. In verse, in public, with full poetic flair. In medieval Iceland, this is no mere insult. It's a legal offense, defamation through verse, known as NED. It wasn't just considered rude, it was potentially ruinous and dangerous. Here words can wound as much as axes, especially if those words are metered, rhymed, and performed with an audience. In a society where your honor is your currency, a poem that calls you a liar, a coward, or even something slightly effeminate can cost you everything. Property, reputation, in extreme cases, your place in the community. The accused, already red from rage, denies the charges entirely. Not the words, the meaning. He claims the poem was satire, a joke, a playful jab meant for laughter, not legal consequence. But no one laughs. The crowd listens intently, murmuring with each verse. Because there's another Icelandic truth at play. If the poem is clever enough, it's believed. If it stings enough, it's remembered. And if it survives in the mind of the crowd, it becomes more than speech, it becomes legend. Historians still debate just how frequently Enid was brought to court. Some say it was rare, a weapon of the verbally elite. Others argue it was rampant, the favored tool of the saga generation, a way to carve your enemy's shame into the air with rhythm and spite. What's clear is that it was taken seriously. A verse could destroy you, especially if it implied certain things like sexual deviance, cowardice, betrayal, or incompetence. In some cases, the accused might challenge the poet to combat. In others, they could demand a counterpoem, a kind of lyrical duel where both sides attempt to outwit and out-honor the other. Today, the elders are unmoved by the defense of humor. They rule the verse as nid and demand reparations. The poet must either retract the verses publicly or submit to a fine 2 ounces of silver and a recitation of apology in the same meter as the offense. You listen as he stumbles through his retraction, something about misplaced metaphors and brotherly jest. It's awkward. The cadence is off. But it's enough. The fine is accepted. The insult technically withdrawn. You glance around. Several people are already repeating fragments of the original poem under their breath. It will live longer than the apology. Later that day, another case brings you deeper into this world of spoken damage. A woman accuses a man of spreading a tale that her family line runs dry and that she cannot bear children. The man denies saying it, but 2 others step forward, one hesitantly, the other with gusto, and confirm that he said exactly that at a funeral, no less. This, too, is nid, not in rhyme, but no less destructive. The elders debate whether it qualifies for public penalty or private reparation. In the end, a compromise, he will pay a fine in cloth and wool and must carry a message of formal apology to her father's household. On foot, through the snow, with a gift of salted meat. There's a rhythm to these punishments, a ritual They're not about humiliation, though they often involve it. They're about restoration. Words in Iceland can break the fabric of society, but they can also sew it back together, one verse at a time. As dusk rolls in, the crowd begins to disperse, but one young man, barely more than a boy, stands and asks to recite something. He says it's not a nid, but a praise poem, dedicated to the law speaker himself. This is a risk. Praise poems are permitted, encouraged even. But if poorly done, they become an accidental insult. The crowd hushes. The boy begins. And it's clumsy, but earnest. He praises the law speaker's memory, his beard, his booming voice, and rather boldly, his ability to sit for long periods without scratching. The crowd laughs, not in mockery, in relief. This is the rare poem that brings people together rather than slicing them apart. As the firelight flickers against your face, you realize that Icelandic justice isn't just about truth or balance. It's about narrative control. Win the story, and you win the moment. Lose the story, and you may lose everything. You curl up that night with verses still echoing in your ears, some cutting some healing, all remembered. Because in this land of frost and fire, stories don't die. They go on trial. The cold greets you like an old acquaintance, the next morning curling around your ankles and sneaking into your sleeves before you fully left the warmth of your furs. You stretch, yawn, and try not to imagine what today's docket will include, because in medieval Iceland, you've learned justice has an unpredictable flair. You arrive just as the elders are forming a circle, not for a fight, not for an exile, but for a testimony. The case is peculiar even by Icelandic standards. A sheep is involved, not as the victim, not even as the stolen property. No, today the sheep is a kind of witness. It starts with two farmers. They share a grazing boundary, though share might be generous. One claims that his neighbor has been sneaking sheep across the invisible line to feed on richer moss. The other denies it. No one saw the alleged intrusion, except perhaps one particular sheep. She's the only one, it turns out, who keeps wandering back to the same disputed patch of land, again and again, as if it's her birthright or her preferred buffet. This alone wouldn't warrant a court case, except the farmer now claims the sheep was trained to do it, to undermine the fence line, make it appear natural, and slowly claim territory. The accusation is essentially one of livestock espionage. Everyone chuckles, except the accuser, who is very serious. He wants restitution for every day the sheep grazed illegally. He's brought a bundle of dried grass samples to prove the better nutrition value. He's even created a crude wooden map showing hoof prints from 3 different mornings. You suppress a smile, but no one dismisses it. Not here. Instead, the elders consult the law. And yes, there's precedent. Icelandic law is filled with clauses involving animals, compensation for sheep lost to wolves, fines for cows that trample neighbors' crops, even rules about horses that disrupt weddings. Animals were, after all, central to survival. But today's debate is more philosophical. Can a sheep act with intent? Can it be influenced to trespass? And if so, who is responsible? A small crowd forms. People offer opinions. One man claims that sheep know more than we think. Another mutters about witchcraft. A boy nearby says the sheep has shifty eyes. A woman nods and adds that the same sheep once ate her mittens. Eventually the decision is made. The animal cannot be punished, but the farmer can. A symbolic fine is issued, 1 fleece's worth of wool, to be handed over to the plaintiff. Additionally, both parties must reinforce their fence. The sheep, meanwhile, is renamed Lugite Law Goat, even though she's not a goat. Everyone seems satisfied. You step back reflecting on what just happened. Justice here isn't always severe. Sometimes it's simply communal maintenance, a way to keep relationships from collapsing under the weight of grudges and stubborn sheep. But the day isn't over. Next comes a more sobering dispute. A man has accused another of burying a horse in a shared pasture without permission. This might sound trivial until you understand the cultural weight of the horse in Iceland. Horses aren't just transport. They're companions, symbols of status, even spiritual markers. Burying one improperly can be seen as disrespect, not just to the land, but to the soul of the animal. The accuser claims that the burial brought bad luck, that two of his own horses fell ill shortly after. The defendant scoffs. He says the land was rocky and useless, that he meant no disrespect, that it was better than leaving the body to rot in the open. But the law is clear: burial must be agreed upon, even for animals. The court rules that the burial must be redone, this time on the defendant's own land, and accompanied by a small ceremony to appease memory. It's not clear whether that means the horse's memory, the land's, or everyone's. But the order is made. Historians still argue whether these animal-related rulings reflect deep animistic beliefs or just practical stewardship. Maybe both. Icelanders lived close to the earth and closer still to their animals. In many ways, the boundary between human and creature wasn't as wide as modern minds would imagine. You start to see a pattern. The law here doesn't try to control nature. It works with it. If a horse dies, if a sheep trespasses, if a dog howls on the night of a full moon, each of these is seen as part of the social web, not outside of it. And then late in the afternoon, a man stands and says he'd like to bring forth a matter of song. Everyone goes quiet. It turns out he's come to honor his old cow who died the previous week. Not for legal reasons, just because she once saved his son from drowning by standing firm in a river and allowing the boy to grab her horn. He reads a short verse choked with emotion. It's not a case, not a trial, just a moment of shared memory. And nobody laughs. That's Iceland. Even animals can become part of law, part of ritual, part of the living story. This society weaves to stay warm in the face of freezing isolation. As the sun dips low, the law goat bleats somewhere in the distance. A man nods solemnly. Someone else hums the melody of the cow poem under their breath. The court adjourns for the night, and you walk home smiling, thinking not about crime or punishment, but about animals that remember people who listen and laws that are shaped as much by affection as they are by fear. The wind has shifted again by morning, bringing with it the brittle scent of distant snow and the promise of another strange day beneath Iceland's low-slung sky. You stretch your arms, stamp your feet into your boots, and begin the familiar walk back to the gathering fields where law and storytelling are still very much in session. As your boots crunch over the frozen ground, you can already hear raised voices. Not angry, just emphatic. You arrive just in time to witness a man with wild hair and even wilder gestures reenacting a scene with theatrical flair. He shouts, trips, and pretends to fall. The crowd chuckles. The accused stands off to the side, arms folded, clearly unimpressed. This, it turns out, is a case of punishment by insult, and it's about to get wonderfully ridiculous. Here's what happened. The plaintiff claims the other man called him a coward, not in private, not over drinks. No, this insult was delivered at full volume during a public feast in front of no fewer than 18 people, 2 dogs, and a wandering bard. The insult. He's the kind of man who wears his wife's mittens and cries when his stew goes cold. Ouch. In medieval Iceland, insults, particularly those that touch on manhood bravery or family reputation, weren't just verbal slights. They were legally actionable. And the more public the insult, the more serious the consequences. Especially if someone goes to the trouble of reenacting their humiliation in front of the court. The accused doesn't deny saying it. His defense is that the insult was provoked that the plaintiff had cheated in a sled race earlier that week by using a greased plank. But that's another case entirely. Today we're talking about mittens and stew. The law speaker clears his throat and begins to recite the statutes relating to verbal injury. They're long, surprisingly long, and you learn in mesmerizing detail that Icelandic law actually broke down insults into categories. Some were just rude, others were shameful, and a special few, those implying cowardice or unmanliness, were enough to demand fines, formal apologies, or in rare cases, sanctioned duels. This one lands somewhere in the middle. Historians still argue about these insult laws. Some say they encouraged civility in a tight-knit society. Others argue they simply redirected aggression into more passive-aggressive forms. But here, as the plaintiff finishes his dramatic reenactment, it's clear that public humiliation has turned into courtroom theater, and the jury is loving it. The elders deliberate, but the outcome is almost predictable. A fine is issued 3 ounces of silver, or the equivalent in dried cod and wool. The twist. The court also orders the accused to host a small feast the following week, and at that feast, he must serve the plaintiff his own stew, piping hot. You don't know whether to laugh or applaud. Justice in this moment is absurd and oddly heartwarming, and yet it holds. The day rolls on and more insults are aired. One man is accused of calling another a soggy duck, which no one entirely understands, but is somehow deeply offensive. Another case involves a woman who spread a rhyme about her rival's cooking abilities, something involving burnt fish, and a curse that makes bread rise sideways. It's tempting to dismiss these as frivolous. But here, reputation is currency. Your ability to trade, marry, or be trusted at the next harvest depends on how people talk about you. Words spoken in front of a fire or whispered in the sheep pen can ruin a man faster than winter. One particular case lingers in your memory. A boy no more than 13 accuses a much older farmer of calling his family thieves by birth. The man laughs. He says it was just a joke. But the boy's father steps forward stone-faced and says nothing for a long time. Finally he speaks. We've lived on this land for 4 generations. My great-grandmother wove cloaks for chieftains. Don't let this pass like fog over the fields. The crowd goes silent. No one laughs anymore. The court agrees. The words were not just an insult, they were a legacy wound. The accused must now apologize, not just to the boy, but to his ancestors. He's instructed to visit the boy's farm, speak to the family elders, and leave a gift at the burial cairn on the ridge. This too is law. You realize watching all this unfold that medieval Iceland didn't separate words and actions the way you might expect. Words are actions, and when they harm, they must be repaired. Not erased, not punished cruelly, but answered with apologies, with gifts, sometimes even with stew. As the last case ends and the crowd begins to drift toward evening meals, you hear one final shout. A young woman has challenged a poet to a verse-off. Apparently he compared her new wool cloak to the hide of a drowned seal. She intends to set the record straight with meter rhyme and a surprising number of words for ugly. The court allows it. And as they trade barbs under the rising stars, you lean back and smile. Icelandic justice may be cold, slow, and a little strange, but it never forgets the power of words or the people brave enough to use them. Today there's no wind. That in itself is strange. You've grown used to the ever-present moaning through the stones, the constant flutter of cloaks like flags of frozen rebellion. But this morning, Thingvellir is still. The smoke from campfires rises straight and unbothered into the pale sky. The hush makes every voice clearer, every footstep louder, and every decision feel slightly heavier. Perhaps that's fitting, because today no one is being fined. No one is being insulted or exiled. Today's cases have to do with the one thing this legal system doesn't have: jails. You've probably noticed by now that no one here gets locked up. There are no barred windows, no guarded stone towers, no punishments involving years of solitude. Icelandic law didn't develop that way, not because people didn't commit crimes, but because they didn't have the resources to contain them. There were no castles, no bureaucracies, and certainly no surplus of food to keep people alive behind walls. So what did they do instead? They used shame. You watch as the first man steps into the center of the crowd. He's young, strong-looking, and very clearly uncomfortable. He's here because he failed to show up for a debt settlement 3 weeks ago. Not a huge offense, no violence. But he broke a promise in front of witnesses. The punishment. He must sit silently on a carved stone stool in the middle of the assembly throughout the entire day's proceedings. He cannot speak. He cannot rise. And everyone knows why he's there. This is known colloquially as the Stone of the Silent One. It's not a formal sentence found in ancient texts. It's a social sentence agreed upon by community members when someone's offense is more about disrespect than damage. He sits now stiff and red-cheeked eyes locked on the ground. Children whisper. Elders glance but say nothing. You notice people are careful not to stand too close. He's not dangerous. Just marked. Historians often struggle to interpret these informal punishments. Were they common? Were they effective? What's certain is that in a small society, being shamed publicly was often more damaging than any physical penalty. These weren't strangers. These were neighbors, trading partners, potential in-laws. Your status here was your shield and your sword. Lose it and you're naked in the cold. Later, another man is brought forward. His crime is stranger. He sang during a funeral. Not loudly, not with joy, but with the wrong tone. His family claims he dishonored the dead by mocking the chants with off-key humming and inappropriate clapping. He doesn't deny it, but he swears he was trying to calm a restless spirit. His own words. Apparently he believed the deceased might haunt the farm unless entertained one last time. The family disagrees. They want compensation, or at least an apology. The solution is elegant. He must return to the burial site and sing again, but this time properly, in front of the family and a local poet who will act as a melody advisor. Yes, that's a real role. The apology will be measured not only in intention, but in musical pitch. You blink. You've watched fines paid in fish. You've seen poems wielded like weapons, but this is legal karaoke as penance. And yet the logic makes sense. No prisons means no space to hide someone away. So Icelandic law focuses instead on exposure. If you shame the community shames you back publicly, visibly, but often with a kind of dry dignity. You hear tales of other punishments used in past years. A man who stole winter grain was ordered to wear a necklace of oat stalks for a week and recite the weather report at every meal. A woman who lied about her neighbor's debts had to carry a pot of ash through town and call out clean hands, clean speech. A youth caught vandalizing a barn was made to repaint it using brushes fashioned from his own clipped hair, creative, cruel, and undeniably communal. You look around and notice how many of these punishments revolve around reintegration, not removal. The point isn't to expel someone permanently, it's to make them face what they did endure, the judgment of others, and then return slightly bruised in ego, but still part of the group. Still not all shaming works. You hear whispers of a man who refused to participate in his punishment, who ignored the court, left town, and returned a year later with an axe and a grudge. The saga says he was never caught, or that he drowned in a fjord, or that he became a ghost who howls on the wind near court gatherings. Depends who you ask, which of course is part of the system too. Stories reinforce memory. Memory reinforces law. And law here is more of a living expectation than a rigid structure. Before the day ends, one final offender is brought forward. She's elderly, bent at the shoulders, but sharp-eyed. She's accused of insulting a healer by calling her a potion-spilling mushroom woman during a feast. The crowd chuckles. Even the healer smiles. Still, an insult is an insult. The punishment. She must carve a small mushroom figure out of driftwood, decorate it, and present it to the healer with a rhyme. She agrees. And you realize the punishment isn't humiliation, it's humbling. It brings people back down to eye level. It reminds them they're not above the group even when their words try to fly higher. As the sky turns the color of chilled ash and the crowd thins, you linger near the silent stone. The first offender is still there, sitting upright, hands frozen in his lap. You nod at him. He nods back. Tomorrow he'll get up, walk home, and life will continue. Because Iceland doesn't lock you away. It just makes you sit still and let everyone remember. By now you've gotten used to the rhythm of the days here, slow, strange, and punctuated with disputes that shift from the deeply personal to the unexpectedly poetic. But this morning, as you make your way back to the field, you overhear something that makes your boots slow mid-step. He called the fish bigger than a whale. A few people around you are already shaking their heads. Not because the statement is scientifically inaccurate, but because it violates something unspoken, yet clearly understood in this society. Exaggeration is dangerous. You pick up your pace. In the heart of the crowd, a tall, wiry fishmonger stands red-faced and indignant. His complaint, a merchant from the next village over, told a gathering at the market that he once caught a trout so massive it made the local whales look like minnows. At first you assume this is a joke, a harmless tall tale, the kind told around every campfire since the dawn of storytelling. But the fishmonger's tone says otherwise. He's not laughing, he's demanding justice. The law speaker clears his throat. He begins to recite a familiar passage, this one regarding false boasting, specifically when it results in injury to another's reputation, livelihood, or standing within the community. Yes, Icelandic law accounted for that too. You listen, blinking through the frost, as he explains that in cases of deliberate exaggeration, particularly when it casts doubt on another person's skill or trade damages may be sought. After all, the fishmonger is a known provider of food. If someone claims to catch bigger, better fish, and loudly it threatens the web of trust that trade depends on, you hadn't thought of it that way. But it makes sense. Historians still argue about the seriousness of these charges. Some claim they were merely symbolic, a way to keep boastful personalities in check. Others argue they served as an early form of brand protection. Reputation, after all, was everything in a land where survival often came down to who trusted whom. The accused, young, energetic, and clearly proud of his fish story, tries to backpedal. He says it was hyperbole. He says it was meant to amuse. He even offers to draw the fish for everyone, which, to his credit, he attempts with a stick in the mud. The drawing does not help his case. Eventually, the court reaches a compromise. The man must pay a fine 1 dried cod per exaggeration, rounded to the nearest believable unit. The crowd laughs, but the punishment is enforced. The fishmonger accepts it, and the court reminds everyone that if you're going to tell tall tales in Iceland, they better be poetic, not commercially damaging. As the morning wears on, more cases follow. A woman is accused of overselling her family's healing herbs. She claimed they cured everything but death. When one buyer developed a rash and blamed her, the dispute came here. She argues that the herbs were fine. The customer, she says, ate them with boiled seal meat. That's on him. Still, the court determines that promising too much, especially in matters of health, requires correction. She's fined a modest fee and required to rewrite her pitch. Good for digestion. Won't cure heartbreak. You realize that exaggeration in Iceland is a kind of double crime. It offends the listener and undermines the speaker's future. Overpromise and people may never believe you again, or worse, drag you before the court of facts and memory. Later that day, an older man steps forward to challenge his neighbor's claim of surviving a winter without firewood. The man had boasted loudly at a feast that he burned nothing but his own anger all season. But the neighbor swears he saw firelight through the man's windows in January. You brace yourself for another fine, but the accused simply nods, smiles, and says, "It was a small anger." The court, pleased with the wit, lets it go. Because here's the twist: exaggeration isn't always punished. It depends on intent, effect, and the context of the boast. A funny story. Probably safe. A reputation-damaging brag, risky. An exaggeration that veers into slander or fraud. Now we're talking sheep fines. You begin to appreciate just how finely balanced this system is. It's not about suppressing speech. It's about guarding reality. When you live in a land where food is scarce, warmth is rare, and every family depends on the cooperation of others, lying, even in jest, can be deadly. And so Iceland crafted a culture of truthfulness, not because it was morally superior, but because it was practically necessary. If someone says they have 5 cords of firewood, they better have 5 cords of firewood. If they say they can deliver milk by next Tuesday, they'd better not show up with yogurt on Thursday. As evening falls, you listen to a final case, this one involving a man who claimed he could predict the weather. His forecasts, it turns out, were hilariously wrong. A wedding was planned in a blizzard. A hay harvest was delayed for 3 days, waiting for sun that never came. And while no one was harmed, the community wasted valuable time and resources. The court issues its ruling. From now on, the man may only make predictions if he wears a sign that says, "These thoughts are mine." The clouds disagree. He accepts it with good humor. You walk back that night with the smell of smoked trout in your nose and a smile tugging at your mouth. In Iceland, even the lies come with consequences, but the consequences often arrive wrapped in wit, community laughter, and just enough shame to keep you honest next time. You wake to a sky like hammered, pewter, flat, and low, promising nothing except maybe a few gusts of ill-tempered sleet. Your breath fogs the air as you pull on your boots and head toward Thingvellir once more, already wondering what stories, legal or otherwise, the day might bring. The ground crunches beneath your feet, still icy from last night's freeze, and your cloak catches stray flakes as you go. By now you've grown familiar with Iceland's peculiar methods of handling law, a stew of memory poetry, insult management livestock disputes, and a social economy of shame. But this morning brings something different, something uncomfortable, because today they're putting a dead man on trial. You find the crowd already gathered. At the center stands a woman in mourning, black, her hair tied in a rough knot, her eyes hollow but unflinching. At her feet, wrapped in an oiled cloth and laid gently across a flat plank, is the body of her husband. He died 3 nights ago, she says, during a heated argument with a local merchant. Not by a wound, not from poison, but from shock collapse after being cursed, yelled at, and publicly shamed. She's not here to accuse the merchant of murder. She knows better. But she claims the emotional assault was so intense, so cruel, that it hastened her husband's end. And because he died mid-dispute, she wants the court to hear his side through her. This is not unheard of. In medieval Iceland, legal momentum didn't always stop when the heart did. If someone died while embroiled in a conflict, especially if the conflict involved debts, insults, or unresolved agreements, the court might still examine their testimony provided someone was willing to speak it. Family members, friends, or even household servants could stand in for the dead, repeating their words, defending their honor, or settling their accounts. You watch now as the woman steps forward and begins to speak. She does not weep. She does not falter. In her voice you hear a mix of grief, fury, and something steadier purpose. She recounts the last conversation her husband had before he collapsed. She quotes his words exactly, or claims to. She outlines his defense, his intentions, and his unresolved complaint against the merchant. The merchant, for his part, looks pale. He does not deny the argument, but he insists his words were deserved. The man owed him money, had lied, had shirked responsibilities. He claims he never raised a hand, only a voice. But the court doesn't care about volume. They care about outcome. This, you realize, is where Icelandic justice becomes something stranger and more intimate than anything you've seen before. The law here acknowledges that actions don't always leave wounds you can see, that words can kill indirectly, that disrespect can echo beyond the grave. And so the judges must weigh not only what was done, but what lingers. Historians still argue whether these posthumous cases were superstition, compassion, or power plays. Some suggest they were rooted in ancestral reverence, the belief that the dead had rights that extended beyond the body. Others think it was a way for families to protect property or public standing. Either way, the dead were not always silent. The court rules that while no crime occurred, the merchant must offer reparations not for murder, but for moral injury. He's ordered to recite a verse in the deceased's honor and deliver 2 barrels of salted butter to the widow before the next full moon. She accepts the judgment, not with joy, but with the weariness of someone who got what she needed, not what she wanted. And the body, it is carried away with solemn care, no longer just a corpse, but a participant in justice. You sit still long after the crowd disperses. The idea rattles around in your chest. Justice doesn't stop at the boundary of death. Not here, not in Iceland. Your legacy can still be protected. Your name still cleaned, your unfinished conversation still answered. Later that afternoon, a different kind of dead man appears, this time in memory. An elder stands to accuse another of breaking an oath made to his now deceased brother. The promise, a shared claim to a patch of fertile valley grassland made 30 years ago, sealed with spit and the blood of a fresh-caught salmon. The accused shakes his head. I remember the salmon, he says, but not the promise. The court chuckles but listens. 2 others step forward to confirm that yes, the promise was made. The court accepts it. The accused is ordered to either honor the original agreement or pay restitution to the deceased's children. He chooses to honor it. You watch as the court documents, by voice alone, that a 30-year-old promise made beside a river still holds legal weight as long as the living remember it, and as long as the dead still have someone willing to speak on their behalf. By evening, a storm rolls in. From the west, its winds howling like wolves, denied a meal. You huddle in your cloak, heading back toward your lodging, but your mind is filled not with wind or cold or the ache in your knees. You're thinking about how in this land, even the dead refuse to vanish quietly. You wake in the middle of the night to the sound of sleet tapping at the wooden slats of your shelter. It's not the kind of sound that startles. It's more like an invitation, a slow, rhythmic reminder that Iceland doesn't stop for sleep or sorrow or even reason. When morning arrives, pale and icy as ever, you wrap yourself tight and return to Thingvellir, under skies the color of ash. Today's first case is not about sheep or fists or stews gone cold. It's about magic. More specifically, it's about someone who's been accused of turning a cow inside out. You blink. You wait for someone to laugh. No one does. The accuser is a thin man with a face that looks like it spent decades squinting into wind. He claims that 3 days ago one of his cows began behaving oddly, walking backward, refusing to eat, mooing in what he describes as a melancholy key. The next morning it was dead, its insides apparently twisted in a way that no honest illness could explain. The suspect, a neighbor. A man with a reputation for speaking to birds and planting herbs by moonlight. A man whose goats never get sick and who once correctly predicted the early thaw. A man, in short, who must be using sorcery. You expect the court to wave it off. But no, this is Iceland. In a land of isolation, long winters, and cultural memory steeped in sagas, belief in magic is not rare. It's baked into the lava rock, folded into the sheep's wool, whispered between verses at dusk. The accused denies everything. He insists his goats are healthy because he treats them well, that his knowledge of weather comes from watching the clouds, not bargaining with trolls. But there's a glint in his eye that unsettles people, and that's often enough. The court doesn't jump to conclusions. Instead, it calls for a test, a legal inspection of the man's property, by 3 elders, accompanied by a local seer who's been trained in reading non-visible signs. Yes, that's a real title. They leave. And for a while the crowd simply waits. People talk quietly. Someone shares bread soaked in warm whey. A boy recites a poem about a seal that knew secrets. You listen, but your eyes stay fixed on the trail the investigators followed. When they return, the news is ambiguous. They found no bones arranged in symbols, no runes carved into floorboards, but they did find a small pouch of ash hanging above the barn door and several feathers from a bird, not native to the region. The law speaker furrows his brow. This is enough for a partial ruling. Historians still argue about how medieval Iceland dealt with cases of sorcery, while the later Christian authorities would grow increasingly harsh, especially by the 17th century. The early Icelandic courts were nuanced. Magic wasn't always forbidden. In fact, certain spells were permitted, especially those involving healing weather or protection. The line between folk wisdom and dark arts was drawn not by what you knew, but by what harm it caused. Here the court rules that although direct guilt can't be proven, the accused must remove the ash pouch and cease all magical practices for 1 year. He must also compensate the cow's owner with 1 fleece, 1 calf, and a public statement of goodwill recited aloud at the next market day. It's not an admission of guilt. It's a public act of reassurance. Because sometimes Icelandic law doesn't seek justice. It seeks balance. Later that day, you witness a very different kind of magical dispute. A woman old slow of speech but piercing in gaze claims that her daughter's dreams have been invaded by a neighbor who once desired her. The daughter has woken 3 nights in a row screaming the man's name, saying he dripped into her thoughts like black snow. The man denies everything, of course. He says he hasn't spoken to the girl in months, that he's been working on building a new roof, and has had no time for romance, real or imaginary. But the court listens, because dreams here are taken seriously. The law speaker calls for a symbolic disconnection. The man must deliver a piece of iron, cool, smooth, and untouched by flame to the woman's house and leave it beneath the threshold. This, according to tradition, severs unwanted spiritual ties. Whether you believe in it or not, the act has meaning, and meaning is what Icelandic justice trades in best. You find yourself growing quiet as the sun sets, not because you're afraid of curses or backward cows, but because something about this system, this blend of superstition and practicality, makes a strange kind of sense. Iceland doesn't have the tools for evidence. No fingerprints, no laboratories. So instead, it uses symbol, it uses story, and it uses ritual, and in doing so, it maintains peace. Not always perfectly, not always kindly, but in a land where snow can bury you by nightfall and grief arrives on the wind, even a half-believed spell is worth addressing, if only to let people sleep at night. As the sky darkens and people scatter back to their homes, the man accused of cursing the cow sits alone by the fire pit. Someone hands him a bowl of soup. He eats it slowly without speaking. No one says guilty. No one says innocent. But tomorrow, everyone will remember the cow. And maybe that's enough. You don't need a sundial to know that justice moves in cycles here, slow, seasonal, and subject to the same forces that shape the fjords. This morning, as you wrap your cloak tighter against a particularly wet wind, you overhear an old man mutter what could very well be the unofficial motto of Icelandic law: nothing gets judged until summer. You smile, because he's not wrong. The next case confirms it. A woman stands before the assembly, arms crossed, jaw set. She's been waiting 6 months to have her case heard, not because the court was full, not because she wasn't ready, but because Iceland's legal system, for all its breadth, is strictly seasonal. That's right. Justice only happens in summer. You look around. The fields are muddy but green. Snow still lingers in the shadows of rocks, but the grass is trying its best. You've learned by now that Althingi, the Central Assembly, meets only once a year at midsummer. That's when most disputes are settled. If you were wronged in October, sorry. Wait it out. No court, no ruling, no formal resolution until the high sun returns. The woman now speaking was robbed, allegedly, of several barrels of dried meat during the winter. She knows who did it. She saw the tracks in the snow. But she couldn't do anything beyond murmured warnings, glares at the tavern, and cold silences at church. She had to wait for this very moment to formally accuse. And she has not forgotten. The accused, a broad man with a cracked tooth and a smirk, denies everything. Says he spent the winter in another valley, that he hasn't eaten dried meat in years, that she's remembering snow, not truth. The court listens carefully, and then something you didn't expect, the weather is brought up as evidence. A shepherd recalls that on the night of the theft, a sudden melt turned the snow to slush just enough to blur the tracks. Another claims he saw the accused near the area that day, carrying a suspiciously full satchel. But that, too, could be imagination. Memories here are long, but not always precise. Still, the court rules in the woman's favor. The man must repay the value of the stolen meat, plus 1 extra barrel for the delay in justice. That's the price of waiting in Icelandic law. The longer the delay, the greater the fine. It's not just compensation, it's restitution for time. Historians have long debated the practicality of a once-a-year legal system. How could people wait so long? What did they do in the meantime? Some argue that the delay encouraged peace, that people forced to simmer their grievances were more likely to settle privately. Others believe it built pressure, that grudges fermented like old milk, and midsummer court was less about resolution and more about strategic explosions. You suspect both are true. A second case that day supports the theory. A man and his brother-in-law have been feuding over a missing boat for 2 years. Not just any boat, a prized fishing skiff, hand-built and rumored to carry blessings from a now-dead uncle. The boat vanished in early spring the year before last. No witnesses, no storm, just gone. The accuser claims it was stolen. The accused claims it was loaned, then accidentally wrecked in a fog. But because the assembly was already passed by the time the event occurred, the case couldn't be brought up until the next summer. By then, tempers had cooled, but so had clarity. Now, a year later, it's finally being heard. The judges listen to the story twice from both sides. They nod, they ask questions, and then they do something beautiful. They ask for poetry, not to entertain, to remember. Both men are asked to present short verses describing the day the boat went missing. Why? Because in Icelandic tradition, memory shaped in verse is often more accurate than memory told in prose. Rhythm sticks, poetry forces precision. The accused recites a halting couplet describing mist and gulls and a disappearing prow. The accuser offers a sharper one evoking betrayal, silence, and an empty beach. The judges listen. One elder nods, another strokes his beard. Then the ruling neither man is fined. Instead, both must contribute equal labor to build a new boat dedicated to the memory of the uncle and offered for communal use during the next herring season. It's not about blame, it's about moving forward. That's what seasonal justice does. It doesn't chase you, it waits. And then it asks, after all this time, do you still want revenge or do you want something useful? You can't help but compare this to modern systems. The Icelanders didn't aim for efficiency, they aimed for return. A return to balance, to cooperation, to collective functioning. Because if every dispute led to exile or execution or endless retaliation, the island wouldn't survive a single winter. There's a strange wisdom in that. As the sun slips sideways into the valley and shadows stretch like cooling embers, you listen to a third case one involving a stolen axe. The theft happened in winter. The evidence melted with the snow, but the anger still fresh. The resolution, a new axe forged together by both parties while supervised by a blacksmith with a fondness for gossip and cold beer. The laughter at the forge, someone says, will do more to heal this than 100 ounces of silver. You agree. And as you head back toward your sleeping place, you realize that here, justice doesn't move slowly. It moves with the seasons. Because Iceland knows what we often forget. There's no need to rush balance. The air today feels different. Not warmer exactly, but softer. Somehow like the wind has decided to take a breath. You walk toward Thingvellir with a kind of quiet anticipation in your chest. It's nearly the end of the gathering season, and people are beginning to whisper about their return journeys, about hay that needs cutting roofs, that need patching children who've grown more wild than wise during their parents' absence. But before they pack up and head home, there's one final tradition to uphold. You reach the edge of the law field just in time to witness the slow, solemn procession up the rocky slope that leads to Lögberg, the Law Rock. It's exactly what it sounds like, a raised, flat outcrop of stone overlooking the plain high enough that a voice from its top can carry down to the farthest edges of the crowd. And at the top of that rock stands the law speaker, the keeper of memory, his cloak snapping behind him like a banner stitched with years. This isn't a trial. There are no defendants or complainants today. This is ritual. This is where the laws are spoken aloud, not because anyone has forgotten, but because remembering out loud is an act of preservation. The law speaker closes his eyes and begins. His voice is steady, not loud, but it slices through the wind like bone through broth. He recites the foundational laws, those that govern land, inheritance, marriage, honor, and death. He names the oaths, the fees, the rituals, the exceptions. He quotes without pause the punishment for sheep theft, the procedures for reconciliation between feuding families, the ways in which a marriage can be dissolved with dignity. It's not just information, it's performance. You watch as children lean against their mothers, eyes wide. Old men nod in time with the cadence. One woman even hums softly, as if the rhythm is a lullaby she's known since girlhood. Historians still marvel at this system, the oral recitation of an entire legal code once each summer by a single individual with no written copy in hand. Some say it's impossible, others believe it was exaggerated. But Icelandic sources insist the law speaker was required to recite 1/3 of the law code each summer, ensuring that the entire body of law was spoken aloud every 3 years. And that makes sense. The because in a place with no printing press, no parchment economy, and a population scattered across frozen valleys and treacherous coasts, the only thing more reliable than paper was people. Memory became archive, voice became signature. You stand listening, awed by the rhythm. The laws are dense but beautiful in their own way. Each clause fits like a stone in a wall. You hear lines about how many witnesses are needed to prove a theft, about what age a child may testify, about when silence counts as agreement and when it does not, even laws about the volume of voice expected in public declarations. Too soft, and the claim doesn't count. That gets a chuckle from the crowd. You look around and realize you're not alone in your reverence. Everyone here, from farmers to poets, traders to shepherds, has shaped their lives around this legal rhythm. They know these laws not because they study them, but because they hear them again and again. In court, in song, in warning, in jest. Suddenly the law speaker pauses, not because he's forgotten, but because this is the moment when traditionally any listener may step forward and correct him. If a recitation is wrong, if a phrase is out of place, someone may challenge it, not for ego, for accuracy. No one steps forward. He continues. You begin to notice how many of these laws aren't about punishment. They're about prevention, about structuring society in such a way that harm is less likely to happen in the first place. For example, the rule that says boundary stones between farms must be walked together by neighbors once each season to confirm their location, or the one that requires communal feasts to include open storytelling time where grievances can be aired in rhyme instead of fists. That's the core of it, isn't it? Iceland didn't build a justice system out of fear. It built one out of memory, rhythm, and shared responsibility. As the sun reaches its highest point, the recitation ends. The law speaker lowers his hands. There is no applause, just silence. The respectful kind, the kind that says, "We heard you." Then slowly people begin to gather at the base of the hill, not to argue, not to litigate, but to share food, tell stories, and reaffirm bonds. This is what happens every summer after the laws are spoken. It's a kind of social sealing, a reminder that while the words may govern the people, must carry them forward. That law is not some towering structure. It's a woven fabric. Every story you tell, every promise you keep, every joke you whisper about cows or ghosts or runaway goats is a stitch in that fabric. As the gathering thins, you wander up the law rock yourself. You stand where the law speaker stood. The view is astonishing. You see the entire valley, the dark ridges of cooled lava, the glint of rivers, the smudged dots of sheep on far hillsides. You imagine a time when this rock was the only courtroom for miles, when truth echoed down these slopes, not from books, but from breath. You place your hand on the stone. It's warm from the sun. Tomorrow people will begin to leave, but tonight they'll feast and sing and tell tales of who was shamed, who was clever, who walked 9 paces with iron, and who had to apologize for calling someone a soggy duck. And when next summer comes, they'll do it all again. You wake to the scent of salt air, wood smoke, and something meat-like being roasted a little too aggressively. Today is the final full day of the assembly, and you can feel it in the rhythm of everyone's footsteps, in the slightly looser way people laugh, and in the smell of travel preparations. Cloaks are being shaken out. Horses are being fed more generously. The cases today you suspect will not be the blood feuds or spellcraft of previous days. They'll be quieter, subtler, but no less important. The first matter brought before the court is one of food, more precisely rotten food, offered as a peace gift. A man stands accused of trying to resolve a years-old land dispute by delivering what was, according to the recipient, a hunk of shark so sour it insulted me in 3 languages. The accused disagrees. He says the shark was fermented according to tradition, a delicacy, an honest offering. You realize we've entered the realm of medieval mediation. Icelanders didn't just resolve disputes with law, they resolved them with meat and gifts and long walks through snow to offer someone a carved bowl or a good poem or a whole smoked lamb and the words, "Let's not fight anymore." In a land without kings or dungeons, making peace required something tangible, something stinky if necessary. The elders examine the shark. Yes, it's been preserved in a wooden cask. A brave young man volunteers to taste it. He turns green but nods. It's strong, he says, but it's not an insult. The ruling the shark was a valid peace gift, but poorly timed. Delivered during a rainstorm without witnesses and not accompanied by the expected verse. The court doesn't punish the giver, but advises that all future peace offerings be made publicly, in clear daylight, and preferably with an apology that rhymes. You chuckle, but the principle is clear. Mediation here isn't just about what you give, it's about how you give it. The next case involves 2 neighboring farms. For years, their families have argued over a stream, who may water their livestock there, and whether the stones used to mark the boundary were moved during the thaw. No one remembers who moved them first. Everyone remembers the names they were called afterward. But this isn't about blame anymore. This is about closure. Both families come forward now with gifts, each wrapped in linen carried by their eldest children. One offers a finely carved set of spoons, the other a small keg of honeyed ale. Both families share bread, tearfully declare the fight unuseful, and request that the court witness their reconciliation. The law speaker nods. The matter is closed, and a new stone marked and recorded is set between their lands with a shared hammer strike. Historians still argue about how formal these peace rituals were. Some believe they were codified, structured ceremonies with specific expectations. Others think they were improvised, guided more by custom than rule. But all agree Icelandic law encouraged peace not just through fines and threats, but through ritualized giving. You sit back and watch a third case unfold. This time 2 men in their 50s, both with graying beards and matching limps, step forward to resolve a dispute that began 30 years ago over a misplaced tent peg at the assembly itself. Yes, a tent peg, apparently one man's shelter, had been set up slightly too far into another's allotted space, and a tent line tripped someone who then spilled stew into someone else's lap. The grudge, like the stew, stuck for decades. Now, facing age and perhaps a need to simplify their lives, the men agree to settle it. Not with silver, not with sharks, but with a shared storytelling night at the next festival. Each will tell his version of the tent peg incident, dramatically, humorously, and with public voting on who tells it best. This is accepted by the court. You're watching a legal system that understands something profoundly human. Not every injury needs a coin. Some need a story. And when a wound is old and shallow, laughter can do more healing than law. Later that afternoon, a woman approaches. She has no complaint, no accusation. She simply wants to thank the court for helping her family avoid a feud. 2 summers ago, her son struck another boy during a market scuffle. The court had ordered a poem, a shared meal, and a week of work mending thatch together. Now the boys are best friends, and the woman has brought blood cake, a delicacy made from sheep's blood oats and fat traditionally offered during truces. She hands it to the law speaker. He takes a bite, smiles. No judgment is needed, just acknowledgement that you realize is the heartbeat of Icelandic justice. Not revenge, not correction, but return to peace, to laughter, to shared spoons and sealed stones and fermented fish that somehow says, I'm sorry. By dusk, the fires are lit early. People begin packing wagons, tying up bundles, bidding each other farewell with handshakes and quiet nods. A boy stands on a rock shouting compliments to anyone who walks by, just in case he offended someone during the gathering and doesn't know it. The air smells of ash smoke and closure. You sit quietly and watch the last peace offerings change hands, and you think maybe the strongest form of justice is not the punishment that comes after harm, but the gesture that keeps it from happening again. The final morning arrives not with drama, but with a long, soft exhale from the land itself. The wind is gone, the light is pale but gentle. The grass, trampled from weeks of feet and fires and arguments, lays flattened in patterns like stories pressed into the earth. You rise early along with the others and make your way to the gathering field one last time. Today there is only one case. It's quiet, almost ceremonial in its pacing, and everyone seems to know it's meant to serve as a kind of ending, not just to this year's session, but to all the old business that still clings to people's boots and hearts like thawed mud. The case, a man gaunt, weathered, and leaning heavily on a carved walking stick, has returned after 20 years of outlawry. Yes, 20. He's not a stranger. He was once known here. His name for a time was spoken in lowered tones. A land dispute had turned violent, perhaps fatally so, and though the facts were never fully proven, he was named a full outlaw and vanished into the outer territories. There were rumors he lived in a cave. He farmed alone near the glaciers. He married a woman who spoke to foxes, but no one ever confirmed anything. And now here he stands, gaunt, older, quiet. He speaks only once I ask to be heard. The court agrees. You lean in. What follows is not a defense, it's a reckoning. He recounts where he went, not in detail, but in tone. The cold, the hunger, the years without speech, the way your own name becomes foreign when no one says it. He admits nothing specific, denies nothing either, but he asks to be returned not to land or status, but to memory, to story. He wants his name back. There's no law that forbids this, and there's no law that guarantees it. The court pauses. A debate begins not about guilt or innocence, but about closure. Some argue that 20 years is enough. Others say time doesn't wipe away what law has written. One woman whose cousin had been involved in the original case stands and says, "My family has nothing left to gain from his silence." That tilts the balance. The law speaker, perhaps in his final act for the year, makes a rare declaration the man may return, but only if he earns his place. Over the coming year, he must visit the family still touched by the original dispute. He must labor where needed, share food, accept silence, and most importantly, he must tell his story publicly, in verse, during next summer's assembly. A collective hum ripples through the crowd. Not approval, not protest, just agreement. And then the case is closed. The man bows his head. He walks to the edge of the gathering and sits by himself, watching the clouds. And just like that, the final name is spoken. The last tale resolved. The court is dismissed. People begin to move not frantically but with purpose. Cloaks are fastened, carts loaded, last hands shaken. Some head west to coastal farms, others northeast toward the river valleys. You watch the land empty like a theater after the final act. And you remain, just for a while, because something about this place deserves a pause. Not for drama, for digestion. You think back to everything you've witnessed, the trials, the insults, the fish-related legal drama, the poetry as penance, the sheep as witness, the hot iron, the dream logic, the ghost-haunted fjords, the rituals of restoration, and the strange haunting logic of exile. What started as curiosity has become something more. You realize that Icelandic justice, peculiar though it may be, offers something modern systems often forget. Context. It's not just about crime. It's about story, place, timing, weather, memory, reputation, community, and the long, slow healing power of being seen and held by people who've known your faults and choose to let you try again anyway. The law here isn't perfect, but it is personal. And that perhaps is the strangest wisdom of all. You take one last look at the law rock now empty. You imagine the echo of old voices, the crackle of law as song, as memory, as shared ritual. Then you turn your cloak against the chill and begin walking. No verdict follows you, just the sound of your own boots in the moss, and the faint closing rhythm of a people who built a society, not out of stone, but out of story. And now with the final ember of our story fading into soft shadow, you feel your body begin to soften just a little into rest. The echoes of Icelandic voices fade into the hush of wind across an ancient plain, and you exhale slowly, knowing that nothing more is required of you tonight. You've wandered through a land where the law was a rhythm, not a command, where justice came wrapped in wool and rhyme, in silence. A land where people spoke memory into truth and let sheep dreams and salted fish settle disputes. Strange? Yes. But in that strangeness, something deeply human. As you sink deeper into stillness, feel how the air settles around you, cool, soft, almost like moss. Let it wrap you. You don't need to solve anything. You don't need to remember the exact punishment for calling someone a seal-faced coward or forgetting your fencing duties. Those stories will hold themselves. You only need to let go. Imagine now a field of grass flattened by stories, a fire still glowing under starlight, and the quiet of a land that trusts its own memory to carry justice through the long winter. Let yourself drift there. No court, no judgment, no voice demanding anything of you. Just a distant bleat, a gentle rhyme, and the silence that finally means you are home. Close your eyes. Let the old laws sleep, and you sleep with them. End of script. Sweet dreams.